To get the main wire fall down for pulling up the whale, they had a block on the corner pole there and another winch to pull the fall down so as they could put it around the tail of the whale. And then once they'd had that on, it was pulled up the ramp. Once the whale was reached up onto the top floor, the hydraulic pump was started. It lifted the ram, two rams, big rams, and it lifted the whole part of the floor up, and that sealed off all that area. Well, that was the hydraulic motor started there. Once you had it running, it was just a matter of opening and shutting these valves here and raise the ram up. These pieces of steel here were the hinge part of the ramp, the actual pivot. Once the hydraulic motors had lifted it up to the top, the two brackets down on the concrete pillar down there were actually for slotting two steel rods in to hold the floor up, and then they could stop the hydraulic motor. And that's virtually, those props held the whole floor in place. So then it became, the whole thing became one floor. The tail of the whale normally came to here when it was pulled up, and the head was back at the top of the ramp. This area here, there was a winch sat here. It was known as the middle stripping winch. It worked on one side of the whale, and up around the corner, when we go up here, was the top stripping winch, and it worked on the other side of the whale. This winch here was used to pull the main fall down. The strop was put around the tail, and it used to pull the wire and the fall down to the whale, and then when it was finished, when it coupled up to the whale, it was winched back up, and it wasn't used until we came to stripping again, stripping the blubber off the whales and taking the backbone meat out and various other aspects of flensing the whale. Normally you had a drum that you sat on with a sack over it, and your gear lever, high and low box virtually. It was just 2-speed, and the steam valve for controlling the winch. When they're taking the blubber off the whale, you sometimes had to stand up and look to make sure that everything was going well, that you weren't taking the blubber off too fast, and made sure you were keeping up with the person that was knifing the blubber off the whale. Once the whale was brought up onto the top, it took probably a quarter of an hour to drag the whale up on top, because you're working through a 4 and a 3 sheath block, and the winches weren't exactly fast, although put on in a different cog, yes, they could rattle along. Situated here was the main fall. It was used for the sole purpose of pulling the whale out of water, and nothing else. This post here was the anchor for the pulling out the whale. It had a big chain wrapped around it. It went out through the concrete block here and down, not quite to the base of to that next block there, and it had the 3-sheath block on it for the double or triple purchase, it would be, for pulling the whale out of the water and up onto the main flensing floor. This track here that has been opened up by Doc I used to come down here to go to work every day. I used to walk down this little track into the back of the station when I was carrying on the job of on the flensing floor or in the processing part of the station. The winch at the bottom of the bank here was used for holding the sperm whales' heads in position so as they could cut the head into small sizes to fit into the digester. It was just a holding winch and just to move the head across the floor. Behind that is the oil tank for the boilers, and behind that is a Scotch boiler that came out of the Cowie, and beyond that is the head of the Hartmann cooker and also a small digester. The wire from this winch came up through this block here, across over to around about here, so as they could strip the blubber off the whale and take the meat off the backbone, and also it had used to pull the stomach and that out of the whale. This is the block that went down to the whales. It had the wire rope around here, and that wire was passed around underneath the whale's tail, and once that had been done and had been connected to this block, they started the main fore winch, and this would keep on pulling the whale up. As you can see, it had a 4 and a 3 sheath block. This being at the 4, the wire used to come down here first, then go through the block in the 3, and so the circuit went round. This winch originally was over on the bone department, and Ted Huntley and Trevor and I shifted it here. I helped to crack the concrete. There was quite a big concrete pad underneath here. Originally the blubber mincer was sitting here, and it was really solid. It took a lot of cracking to break the concrete to get a decent foundation for this winch to sit on. This winch was put here for the sole purpose of pulling the sperm whale heads and holding them in position whilst they actually cut the head into slithers so as they could feed the digester or the kavana. The floor came straight along here to about this position here, and then ran across, and it had another step down onto that level there, and that was used for the same purpose of cutting the blubber. The blubber was brought up onto this platform here, slithered into long strips. The longer the strip, the better, because you could get a lot in the kavana at one time. It was only after the kavana was getting fairly full that you actually had to cut it into smaller chunks to fill the kavana completely. It's one of the aluminium nails that held the roof down. Unfortunately, with aluminium, any sun that went over the top, the roof used to shrink or expand, and it used to pull the nails, and every month or so you had to go around and nail all the nails back down again. They sometimes used to come right out of the timber altogether. Towards the latter part, they got twisty nails that stopped that happening. This is one of the original nails, aluminium nail. This is, we're now back on the lower floor. This is the processing part of the station, where there was mainly only about 2 or 3 people running the whole of this part of the processing plant. This is a kavana cooker. It had a 25 horsepower electric motor sitting there. The switching gear was over the other side. Once the doors were shut, steam was put into the kavana, and it was raised to 60 pounds pressure. We preferred with the sperm whales to cook at 60 pounds, but on humpbacks it was only 58. Once it reached 60 pounds and it was left for half an hour, we'd start drawing material off into the separator. And that had 2 positions that you could draw the oil off from. One was a third of the way up from the bottom, and the other one was at the bottom of the cooker. These valves here were where the steam went in. There was 2 on this side, and it came down this pipe here from the boiler over there. It had a pressure valve situated here that once it got up to 60 pounds pressure, it used to shut the steam down a bit, so it ran constantly at 60 pounds. Once it finished filling, we put in salt water, went into the kavana, and after it had been quarter full, the steam was then turned on. And after about an hour, it took normally an hour to get it up to pressure and to start the process. From here, we'd open this valve, and this used to go across into the separator that was situated behind the Kavana. The separator was situated in this area just here, and it had a revolving sweeper in the bottom, and as it was drawing oil off, so more material was coming out of the Kavana, because as you're drawing off, more's coming back across. Once the oil had finished, we'd blow the bottom of the separator down, and that used to go into the drain, and then we'd allow it to settle for another quarter of an hour, and then we'd start the process again of drawing oil off. This is the preheater for the oil. It came from the tanks, the storage tanks, the small storage tanks. After the oil had come out of the Kavana, it was pumped back into here, preheated, so then it could go through the separator. In this area just here was the pumping part. There was 4 pumps along here, and each pump had various uses. One was for pumping the oil through the separator, another one was pumping the oil to the storage tanks, to the main storage tanks. Another was pumping oil from the tanks that the oil had been stored in, whilst the other was going through the separator. These pipes here were the main steam feed. So it's got a big coil inside the tank, and these were actually the steam feed. These pipes here, the outlets from the steam feed. So the steam went through the coil and it came back out, those ones here. These ones here were for the oil, to drain out the oil out of the tank. And these ones up the top here were the oil going into the tank from the small storage tanks underneath the hill. We had 2 separators, one situated here and another one situated there. Plus we had 200-gallon saltwater tank that fed the separators, and the salt water, the warm salt water, helped to clean the oil. This piece of steel here is the top of the Hartmann separator, and you had pipes coming off in all sorts of directions, and a lot of them went into a sight glass. So as when the oil it got to a certain level, you could see how much oil was floating on the top of all the other material. And if there was enough to do a draw-off, you'd start the draw-off process. This is a bit of whale oil come off the top of the cooker. Unfortunately, time has taken its toll. It's lost all its distinctive smell now. It's still quite hard, but it's breaking down to virtually compost. You can still smell the smell of boiler oil. This is a Scotch boiler. It came out of the old Cowie. They brought the Cowie down here, buckled the boiler out, and the Cowie was taken away and scrapped. And this was put in its place for the steam for the Kavana, all the winches. There was another Cochrane boiler sat over there, and between the two, it wasn't really enough steam to run the plant. Prior to filling the Kavana, we used to start bubbling steam in it, so we'd have both boilers coming up to 100-pound pressure, so as to keep the process going. If we didn't, and one had shut down, it took quite a while for it to ignite again and process steam. So we used to get into trouble with the top floor with bubbling steam into the bottom of the cooker, because it used to get quite hot and there'd be steam bubbling out the top whilst they were still trying to fill it. And we'd get loud shouts, "Turn the steam off!" So we'd have to go and slow things down. But we didn't really like doing that, because if the boilers were still fired up and still producing steam, and before they reached the point of 100 pounds and shut themselves down, we'd try and keep on bubbling a bit of steam in, or wherever we could use steam, so as we'd keep the pressure going. Once they'd shut the doors, then we could open up the valves fully and start the process of cooking the material in the Kavana cooker. There was a pump here that fed the water into the Scotch boiler and also into the Cochrane boiler. They were all automatic, but now and then one wouldn't fire up, and occasionally we'd get the ladies from up on the village behind and they'd come down and say, the boiler's not going. And you'd go outside and sure enough there'd be white smoke coming out the top, and you'd come in here and shut the motor down and then try and ignite it again. Occasionally you'd come in and all of a sudden it'd ignite on its own and there'd be a loud bang and all the doors would fly and you'd think the whole lot had blown up. But the nozzle from the burners used to go in through here, and these were just to add to the air. They were quite often just flapping as the process went on, and also you had air sucked in through there as well. On this side here, it had a automatic injector that used to put water into the boiler. It was a bit fickle. Sometimes it'd work, sometimes it wouldn't. If it didn't work, the water would be pouring out onto the floor, and it was very subject to the pressure on the boiler as well. In this corner was the day tank. It was fed from up above. Here was a 125 kilowatt Detroit diesel, 260 horsepower, 6-cylinder, 110 series motor. Same applies here. And here was a 25 kilowatt Detroit diesel, 55 horsepower drive in the 25 kilowatt. You can still see the conduit tubing going to the switchboards. This was all part of the generator room, this area just here alongside the boiler room. Over here we had the main switches for switching the power on. These are the bus bars for all the 400 volt power. Underneath was the main switches, so as once you've got the engines going and they're up to revs, the cycles were on, you'd switch in the main switch and it'd supply the station with power. This switch here supplied power to Whakanui or Whakanui. You can still see the name Whakanui up there, and that supplied power to the bulldozer pump that used to pump water over the hill to supply the freezers. Up in the little gully here was the original stream that fed the station. It had an earth dam up in the gully a little bit further, but unfortunately it never gave enough water once they really started to, in the latter part, for running the station. So then they got water out of the main gully, but even that didn't supply enough. So they then, when they started processing the meat and they had freezers, they then got water from over in Whakanui, which is a mile away, and they pumped it up over the hill and around the road and fed the freezer units. This was the diesel tank that ran the generators, and every day you had to fill these with diesel. Had dipstick in the top, and you should pull out the dipstick to see how much oil, diesel fuel was in it before you turned the pump on. And you could roughly knew how many gallons you had to pump and how long to leave the pump on to fill it.